All right, let's jump right into this deep dive on Donald Trump's recent interview with Joe Rogan.
It's such a fascinating interview, I think, because you really see Trump unfiltered in this one.
Oh, for sure. It's not some carefully crafted speech or press conference.
Yeah,
You know, this is him just talking.
exactly. So
Yeah.
we get to see some pretty unguarded insights, I think, into how he really thinks.
Yeah. And he doesn't hold back on anything, really, from his days in the White House to tariffs and even nuclear power.
Yeah.
I was surprised by some of the stuff he said.
One of the first things that he talks about is that transition, from The Apprentice to the Oval Office. And I mean, talk about two completely different worlds.
Right. It's a huge leap. And he actually describes it so vividly when he's talking about driving down Pennsylvania Avenue on Inauguration Day. You can almost feel that weight of the moment, like, the crowds and that intense security. He even brings up past presidential assassinations, which is kind of chilling.
Yeah. That's a powerful image for sure. I mean, it really captures that immense responsibility that comes with being president and the risks, too.
And then he talks about walking into the White House for the first time. I mean, he's a guy who's built his career on luxury and aesthetics. And you can tell he's really impressed by the White House interior. He even says that people don't really talk about how beautiful it is.
That's such an interesting detail because I think it gives us a glimpse into how Trump views the world, right? Like, as someone who appreciates the finer things and wants to project this image of success and power.
Totally. And he's pretty open about the fact that he didn't feel totally prepared for the intensity of the job either. He says he was mainly focused on just governing the country and survival because of all the attacks and the impeachment attempts right from the start.
Oh, wow, right out of the gate.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how polarized things were right from the beginning and how much scrutiny comes with that office.
Can you imagine having to deal with impeachment proceedings right off the bat? It would be insane.
Oh, yeah, it would definitely shape your approach to the job for sure and your relationships with everybody.
Speaking of relationships, he makes it sound like putting his cabinet together was one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah.
He talks about having to rely on people's recommendations to fill these roles and how everyone wants these jobs.
He even mentions this one person in New York who was begging him to be Secretary of State, but then would publicly act like they didn't even want the job.
Wow. So much goes on behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah. A lot of ambition and maneuvering. I'm sure you've probably seen it yourself in high-stakes environments.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
So to describe these career politicians, he uses this really interesting analogy. He calls them stiffs.
Stiffs.
Yeah, like implying that they're more worried about protecting themselves than actually doing anything bold.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. And he tells this story about this congressman who wouldn't help him with this really simple licensing issue because he was worried about it becoming controversial.
Hmm.
Trump saw that as a real lack of courage, putting political survival over doing what's right.
That really highlights his approach to leadership then, I guess, and his dislike for bureaucracy.
And what I found interesting is that he admits he made some bad choices in those appointments, too. Specifically, he regrets picking John Bolton and John Kelly.
Huh. That's pretty rare to hear a politician openly admit they made mistakes.
I know, right? It makes him seem kind of human.
Yeah. More relatable, for sure.
Okay, so let's move on to what Trump usually considers one of his biggest successes, is economic policies. He's really proud of the tax cuts, the military rebuilding, and his Supreme Court appointments. He sees these as victories for the American people.
And of course, we can't forget about his love of tariffs. He calls it the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He believes they were absolutely essential for protecting American jobs and businesses from unfair competition, especially from China.
Yeah, he gives this example about this huge car manufacturing plant that was going to be built in Mexico. And he says he single-handedly stopped it by threatening tariffs.
Wow, he really believes in that economic tool.
He does. And I think a lot of people have probably heard about tariffs, but they may not realize how they actually affect them. When countries slap tariffs on each other's goods, the cost of those imports goes up, which means prices go up for consumers like you and me.
Right. It's a complicated issue, and there's always a risk that those tariffs could backfire and end up hurting consumers and businesses in the long run if they lead to trade wars.
Yeah, there are definitely different perspectives on that. He also talks about the deficit. He acknowledges that it increased under his presidency, but he argues that it would have been paid down if not for the pandemic.
Which raises questions about, the long-term effects of those tax cuts and how unpredictable events can throw a wrench in the best laid economic plan.
Absolutely. Okay, get ready, because now we're going to dive into his views on environmental regulations. And this is where his perspective really clashes with a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, he's coming from a background in construction. So he sees a lot of these regulations as roadblocks to economic growth. He talks about his own experiences in New York dealing with these lengthy environmental impact studies. It was clearly frustrating for him.
So he's basically arguing for less regulation, which he thinks would boost the economy and create more jobs.
Exactly. And he takes it a step further by saying that any efforts the U.S. makes to combat climate change are basically canceled out by China because they're not doing their part. He points to all the air pollution coming from China and their continued use of coal plants as evidence.
That argument really highlights how complicated it is to deal with global environmental problems and getting different countries to work together.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. He's really critical of windmills.
Windmills.
Yeah, he argues that they're actually harmful to birds and whales.
Huh, I've never heard that take before.
Yeah, and he even tells this story about California's water mismanagement. He thinks that the state could have plenty of water if they just managed it properly. He talked to Devin Nunes and some other congressmen about it, and he saw all this dry land while he was there.
So basically, he's skeptical about renewable energy sources and thinks that environmental concerns are often overblown.
Right. He thinks the U.S. shouldn't be afraid to use its own energy resources like oil. He says it could be done responsibly.
So you can see how that clashes with the push for clean energy.
Totally. It's a reminder that there are some really strong opinions on both sides about how to balance economic development with protecting the environment.
For sure. And it's something that comes up a lot in politics.
Okay, now brace yourself for this. He actually claims that nuclear power is a viable option and that we should be more worried about nuclear weapons spreading than climate change.
Wow, that definitely goes against the grain.
Yeah. He even tells a story about his uncle, Dr. John Trump, who was a professor at MIT and apparently foresaw the power of nuclear weapons. So maybe there's a family connection to scientific thinking there.
That's a fascinating anecdote. I mean, it adds a personal dimension to his views on this really complex issue.
Right. And then out of nowhere, he starts praising Elon Musk. Calls him a genius.
What?
Yeah. He even tells this story about watching a SpaceX rocket land and then calling Musk just to make sure it was really him. Like, he couldn't believe it.
Wow. So he recognizes Musk's talent even though they probably disagree on a lot of things politically.
It seems like he really admires that kind of innovation and ingenuity. And it's these unexpected turns that make this interview so captivating. He jumps from talking about nuclear weapons to praising Elon Musk. It's really unpredictable.
He's a master storyteller, that's for sure. He knows how to keep people on the edge of their seats.
Okay, and speaking of captivating, let's move on to something that always gets people fired up.
Yeah.
His claim that the 2020 election was stolen.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, this is where things get really heated. He gets so frustrated when he tries to explain his evidence and people interrupt him.
This is a topic that still divides the country, I think. Whether you agree with him or not, his claims about the election and how upset he is about it are a big part of the political landscape right now.
Absolutely. And it's important for people to understand his arguments, even if they don't agree with them. So he gives a few specific examples to back up his claims, like the fact that some states changed their election rules without getting approval from their legislature.
Didn't follow the proper procedures, which could have disenfranchised voters and made the election illegitimate.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that courts all over the country, including some with conservative judges, threw out legal challenges based on this argument. So it's complex.
Oh, for sure. And it just shows how much distrust there is around elections these days.
Then he brings up the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
He's convinced that the media and intelligence officials deliberately suppressed that story and dismissed it as Russian disinformation. And he thinks it had a big impact on the election outcome.
It feeds into that whole narrative of a biased media and a deep state working against him.
Exactly. And he connects it to his belief that the push to get rid of voter ID requirements is all about making it easier to cheat.
Which is a super controversial issue. Democrats argue that voter ID laws make it harder for minorities to vote, while Republicans say they're needed to prevent fraud.
Yeah, it's a debate that's happening all over the country, and it's probably going to be a big issue in future elections.
Yeah.
He also makes this really explosive claim that 51 former intelligence officials lied about the Hunter Biden laptop, calling it Russian disinformation when they knew it wasn't. Wow. Yeah, it shows how much he distrusts the intelligence community and how willing he is to challenge them, especially when they contradict him. It also shows how important it is to be critical of information that comes from people in authority. Just because they say something doesn't make it true.
That's a really good point.
And he's really passionate about this idea that mail-in ballots are ripe for fraud. He even brings up a commission led by Jimmy Carter that he says found that mail-in ballots are easy to manipulate.
Now, that commission, the Carter-Baker Commission, did raise some concerns about mail-in ballots. but they ultimately conclude that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in the 2000 election. So it's important to look at the whole picture.
Definitely. We have to understand the nuances and context of all these claims, especially when we're dealing with so much misinformation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've just scratched the surface of this interview.
I know, right? There's so much to unpack.
Yeah, it's full of complicated topics
Yeah.
and controversial claims, and this is just the beginning.
Well, stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be getting into Trump's thoughts on immigration, the JFK files' extraterrestrial life, and his vision for the future.
It's going to be wild.
Yeah.
Buckle up. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Donald Trump's conversation with Joe Rogan. We're picking up where we left off with his views on the 2020 election. Now let's get into another hot-button issue, immigration and border security.
Oh, yeah, this is an area where he doesn't hold back at all. He's really passionate about closed borders, and he talks about all these dangers that come with open borders, unknown individuals coming into the country, the possibility of more crime and human trafficking.
Yeah, he paints a pretty stark picture. And he even argues that the Biden administration is basically encouraging illegal immigration with their policies.
Like with amnesty and creating pathways to citizenship.
Right. He thinks it's all about getting votes.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. He basically thinks the government is manipulating the system for political gain. And he tells this story about a small town in Ohio that was suddenly flooded with like 32,000 migrants. He talks about how it overwhelmed their local resources, especially healthcare and education.
Wow, 32,000. That's a lot for a small town to handle.
Yeah, and he's appealing to these real anxieties that people have about their communities being overwhelmed and their way of life being disrupted. It's a powerful argument, even if you don't agree with him.
Oh, for sure. It's a very real concern for a lot of people.
Right. And it's important to remember that this is a really complex issue. There are legitimate concerns about border security, but there are also humanitarian concerns and economic factors to think about. Trump tends to focus on the negative side of things, though.
Yeah, he's definitely pushing a specific narrative.
Okay, ready for a complete change of subject.
For hit me.
Let's talk about the JFK files. He mentions them briefly and claims that he was asked not to release the remaining classified documents by people he considers to be reasonable people. He hints at possible national security risks, but promises to release everything if he's elected again.
Oh, classic Trump. He loves a good mystery.
It plays into his whole image as an outsider who's fighting against powerful forces.
And it keeps people guessing.
Exactly. Now, on a totally different note, Rogan asks him about extraterrestrial life.
Which is something Rogan is really into.
Yeah, and Trump's response is kind of vague. He says there's no reason not to believe in aliens, but it's not something he's really focused on.
So he's not ruling it out, but he's not really embracing it either.
Right. And then he drops a little bombshell. He claims he's talked to 3 or 4 guys who've convinced him that there's definitely something there when it comes to UFOs. But he doesn't go into any details.
Of course not. He likes to keep us in suspense.
It's like he's hinting that he knows more than he's letting on.
And that Rogan brought up that 2004 incident with Commander Fravor and the Tic Tac UFO, and he didn't really say anything about it.
Yeah, he just kind of brushes it off, which makes it even more intriguing.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth and talk about his views on the war in Ukraine. He says that if he were president, he could easily end the war.
Like, just snap his fingers and it's over.
Pretty much. He says it's all about his relationships with Putin and Zelensky and America's power to influence things.
So basically, he thinks he's the only one who can fix it.
Yeah, and he points to his use of tariffs as an example of how he gets things done. He talks about how he stopped France from taxing American companies by threatening them with a 100% tariff on their wine and champagne.
Wow, that's aggressive.
He's all about projecting strength and using leverage. But some people argue that his approach is too simplistic and that it ignores the importance of diplomacy.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
And he's really critical of how Biden has handled the war. He thinks Biden's weak and incompetent and that he's not using America's power effectively. He says that China and Russia respected him because they knew he wasn't afraid to use force.
He even says that China wouldn't have dared to send that spy balloon over the U.S. if he were president.
Yeah, he thinks they were too scared of him. It's hard to know if that's true, but it shows how much he believes in projecting strength.
Definitely. Then he goes on to criticize Kamala Harris.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
He doesn't hold back at all. He questions her intelligence and says that bad things will happen if she becomes president.
It's pretty harsh. But it's a tactic he's used before attacking his opponents personally to discredit them.
It's all part of the game.
Right. He also doubts that Biden will even be the Democratic nominee in 2024. He thinks they'll try to replace him with someone else.
Interesting. So he's already looking ahead to the next election.
Always. And then he tells this story about how Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, told him that his appearance on the Full Send podcast at a McDonald's was one of the biggest things they've ever seen on Google.
At a McDonald's.
Yeah, it's a weird flex, but
Wow.
he's basically using it to show how popular he is, especially with younger voters.
He's a master of social media for sure.
Absolutely. And then he circles back to the JFK files. He says he wants to release them for the good of the country, even though people have warned him not to.
He loves to play the hero.
Definitely. And of course, he brings up election integrity again. He talks about the need for voter ID and stricter rules for mail-in ballots. He really wants his supporters to believe that the system is rigged against them.
It's a powerful message, and it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Even though his claims about widespread voter fraud have been repeatedly debunked by election officials and courts.
Yeah, it shows how deep the divisions are in our country. So we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. We've talked about immigration, the JFK files, extraterrestrial life, and the war in Ukraine. It has. And we've seen how Trump blends personal stories, policy pronouncements, and attacks on his opponents to create this really compelling narrative that appeals to his base.
He's a master of storytelling, that's for sure.
Get ready for the final part of this deep dive, where we'll break down the key takeaways from this interview and explore the broader implications of Trump's perspective. What does it all mean for you and the future of American politics? Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Donald Trump's interview with Joe Rogan. We've covered a lot of ground, right from his time in the White House to his views on everything from tariffs to UFOs.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. And now that we've heard it all, what do you think are some of the key takeaways?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how Trump portrays himself as a fighter, someone who's not afraid to go up against the establishment. Even after being president, he still sees himself as an outsider battling a corrupt system.
It's a powerful image, and it definitely resonates with his base.
Oh, absolutely. He taps into that sense of frustration that a lot of people feel, like the system is rigged against them. And he offers these simple solutions to really complex problems.
He's a master of those catchy slogans, too, like, "Make America Great Again," or "The most beautiful word is tariff."
They stick with you, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. He knows how to use language to get people's attention and make them feel like he's on their side. But he also makes a lot of bold claims, some of which are pretty questionable.
Right. And that's the challenge with analyzing someone like Trump. You have to separate the showmanship from the substance.
Exactly. You have to be able to cut through the hype and get to the facts.
He's an entertainer at heart,
Yeah.
He knows how to keep an audience engaged, even if it means stretching the truth sometimes.
So what do you think his biggest motivation is?
Well, it seems like he really wants to be seen as a winner, someone who's always in control. And this interview really reveals a lot about how he sees the world and how he operates.
One thing that's really striking is his absolute conviction that the 2020 election was stolen from him. He's not backing down from that at all. And it seems to be driving a lot of his actions and his rhetoric.
It's definitely a core part of his message, and it resonates with a lot of his supporters.
He's basically saying that he's the only one who can fix things. He's the savior, the deal maker, who can outsmart America's enemies and make the country great again.
It's a powerful message, especially for people who feel like the country is headed in the wrong direction.
It gives them hope, but it also carries some risks. His rhetoric can be very divisive and inflammatory.
Right. It can create a lot of tension and conflict.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest one is that Trump is a master manipulator of narratives. He knows how to tell a story that connects with people's emotions, even if it's not completely true.
So we need to be careful not to just accept everything he says at face value.
Exactly. We need to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
We need to check the facts and consider different perspectives.
Especially in this age of social media where information spreads so quickly.
It's so easy to get caught up in the echo chamber and only hear what you want to hear.
Right. We need to be more discerning about the information we consume and the sources we trust.
And I think it's important to remember that even though we might disagree with Trump, he's still a major force in American politics. His ideas and his rhetoric have a huge impact on the national conversation.
So we need to be informed and engaged. We need to participate in thoughtful discussions and be willing to listen to different viewpoints, even if we don't agree with them.
That's how we can start to bridge these divides and find solutions that work for everyone.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. Remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to discuss.
Exactly. Don't stop asking questions. Don't stop seeking knowledge. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.